everybody, it's your girl, Coach Christal. Welcome to another installment of Wisdom Wednesdays. If you're just joining us, this is a weekly live stream where I get to talk to people who have not only inspired me, taught me, or are continuing to cultivate a life that they love through vision, but also people who I just want to share with you as inspiration and as a real articulation of what living a life by design might look like. So let me welcome you into our community the same way we start each and every one of our endeavors. It's with our company mantra that just says a lot of things happened before this, and I guarantee a lot of things are going to happen after this, but I promise to be here with you now. Please be here with me now. Now, if you've been watching Wisdom Wednesday, I just want to let you know that we are streaming live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube at the Coach Christal YouTube page. But also, you can catch Wisdom Wednesdays on the go on Spotify as well. So if you want to jump over to Wisdom Wednesdays with Christal Brown on Spotify, you can subscribe, listen to it on your walk, however you want to engage. But we just want to make sure that we're making the information available to you as many ways as we can. Tonight, I have the opportunity to talk to Kevin, who is the executive director of Vermont Futures. And what's interesting about this conversation, well, I think where the conversation is going to go because these are not scripted, but what I think is so interesting about building futures and working with other people through leadership and mentorship and coaching for communal good is that it really goes back to one of the principles that we hold true and dear here at Steps and Stages is that your vision is not just for you. So please help me welcome Kevin Chu. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me. I feel blessed to be here.
Hey, it's such a pleasure, such a pleasure. So we were just doing some calculations, y'all, backstage, like, when did we meet? I don't know. So I think it was 2012. We met at Middlebury College before Kevin became an alum, before the real world kind of set in. But Kevin, give us a little bit of your backstory so that we can start this conversation with our guest understanding what you've been doing in the world.
Certainly. So my backstory begins with my parents who immigrated to Vermont, of all places, back in 1986. And they came to the United States in pursuit of the American dream for economic mobility, and landed in Vermont because I have an aunt who married an American. So they came with one social connection, very little money, no college degree, and just made the brave decision based on a vision that they had for what they wanted out of their own future. Yeah. And I'm so happy to have landed here in Vermont, of all places. And I like to say I grew up in Vermont, and I look forward to growing old here too. Mm-hmm. So I got to grow up during a very special time in Burlington when there was an influx of immigrants and refugees really from all over the world. I think back to my time at Burlington High School, pre-Macy's, and the lobby of the high school had flags from all the different countries represented among the student body. The word welcome was written in 52 different languages. And in those moments, I felt like I got a glimpse of what the future of Vermont could be. So those experiences growing up certainly inform how I think about my work now, who I want to be moving forward. And I took those experiences with me to Middlebury College, where I studied the environment and education. And those images of what the future of Vermont could be have stuck with me even after graduation, and how I apply myself to all the different types of work that I do, whether it's with the Futures Project, whether it's through coaching, track and field. I work with the jumpers at Middlebury College. Feel very blessed to continue to serve my alma mater. And I come back to 4 very simple words that I try to live by, which is move forward and give back. I try to move forward in the way I continue to grow in pursuit of my vision, and give back to the community that helped me to get to where I am now.
Kevin, that's really beautiful, right? Because I think, we have so many labels and ways that we kind of categorize people these days. And so having, coming from an immigrant family or being a first-gen college graduate or, all the things that kind of happen as a result, right, of how we enter the world, sometimes becomes so ingrained in our identity that the future of where we are is not about like integrating us into that at all. So tell me a little bit about how you integrated not only the future that you could see for the place you were in, like Vermont, the state, but also the family you were in.
Yeah, I come back to one thing that I'm trying to do through my work is dispel myths and narratives, using data as a way to do that.
Hmm.
And I've heard so many different definitions of what it means to be a Vermonter through my time growing up here.
Uh-huh.
Some of them I agree with, some of them I don't.
Yeah.
We could get into a deeper conversation about that if you'd like. Um, but to me, a Vermonter should be anyone who wants to be here and contribute meaningfully to these communities, regardless of where they came from, what language they speak, how they look or dress, who they love. And that's how I try to integrate my experiences coming from an immigrant family, a family that looked different, sounded different, ate different things,
Hmm.
but also found community here and found people that were very supportive and helped us on our journey. So through my work, I try to move forward and give back in that way of making sure that Vermont continues to be a place of opportunity, regardless of where someone comes from. I want it to be a place where they can pursue a dream and keep moving forward in their own life.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because a lot of times when we want to think of ourselves as really rooted in a place, right? We often think about building community, building networks, nets that hold up and work for us. And I often find that that definition of community, depending on where you are, really shifts and changes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so as you've kind of grown up in Vermont and stayed growing in Vermont, how do you currently define community?
Yeah, you mentioned a great word there, which is change, which sometimes can be hard. It can be difficult. It can feel risky. But I think it's the beautiful thing about communities that people can enter, people can leave. The community itself can evolve as the individuals evolve.
Mhm.
And that's something that I try to bring into how I think of community in Vermont. We saw massive change over this past month, physical change with floods to infrastructure to roads and buildings. But the community itself still holds a set of core values and still cares. And I feel like in this time when there's been massive transformational physical change, actually, we see that the character of Vermont shines brightest, and it's the connection between the people who are here.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I think there's something about community, no matter where you are, that is hard won, and it is fought for, right? And I think that's really when you see people at their best in terms of our collective humanity, right? So
Hmm.
we have had a lot of fellow citizens in our state, in our little state of Vermont, lately, who have undergone flooding and loss of houses and businesses, and the community has really shown up. We've seen a collective effort, whether it be through raising money, GoFundMe's, NPR, VPR, all of the kind of things galvanizing together. How do you see coming out of a pandemic and now flooding, right? And how do you see the Vermont Futures Project or your work really allowing us to build bridges to the next part of the state?
It starts off with asking where it is we want to go and
Mm.
trying to define what that is. We're currently working on developing an economic action plan and setting some bold aspirational targets for the state to rally around. And certainly that work is data informed. I'm not just picking numbers out of a hat.
Right.
But we also have to change sentiment and mindsets and beliefs to be able to start taking effective action towards those targets. So in the coming weeks, we'll be releasing targets on population and housing for the year 2035, which may feel far away for some, may feel very close for others.
Right. Right.
And we want to see the population grow to about 802,000 by 2035. And certainly a big part of making that happen will be growing the housing stock to be able to support a population of that size.
Right, right. And I think this is really interesting, Kevin, because you're bringing up things that people know are tangible, but sometimes don't relate into their own kind of self-development. I heard something really amazing today that said personal development is not really about development at all. It's about discovery. And
Mm.
as we start to say and define who it is we want to be as individuals, as families, communities, states, regions, countries, we have to have that curiosity of discovery. And as we do that, and we can look at the data and track our takeaways, we can see where the pitfalls are. Where do you see some of the data trends and the pitfalls in terms of like statewide growth, because I think it's not just Vermont, right? It is the way that we look at evolving communities. So where do you see those kind of dips, peaks, and valleys?
That's right. So the data have been quite clear for some time that Vermont has an aging population, and in some ways we're leading the country in this regard, one of the oldest states by median age. And this transition is happening across the entire United States.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's actually a position of opportunity for Vermont to take the lead in asking, how do we serve the needs of the people who are already here, because time only works in one direction, right? So we'll see the population continue to get older. And as that happens, there are workforce implications, there are community implications in terms of certain services like healthcare and education and childcare. So we can look to the data to understand current challenges and try to anticipate future needs. But at the end of the day, we also have to come back to, how do we want to take care of each other moving forward? And can we do that by ourselves? Or do we need to necessarily look at conditions of growth to deepen the bench and to create opportunities here in Vermont for people who might not be here already?
Right. Because, I mean, there's always, I think about this anytime I'm looking through a set of data or budgets or numbers, like, what's the story behind the number? Right. And so when you say,
I love that you asked that.
Right, we have this aging population. Tell us the story behind the numbers, Kevin.
All right. Well, you probably noticed that I said 802,000, not 800,000. So part of that is because of the identity of Vermont around the number 802. So I want to set a vision for Vermont that we have some sort of identity in, and that number 802 represents so much to so many people. So it's something that I think we can rally behind. But the story behind the number, if we take a look at it simply through an economic lens, Vermont needs more people. We can see that from a workforce perspective. The story that doesn't get told often enough is more people need Vermont. From a social perspective, from an environmental perspective. I know we just had the floods, but if we look at long-term climate projections, Vermont is going to be a favorable place as climate continues to change, and more people will need places like Vermont. I think we've seen already people with choice, climate migrants who have the privilege to pick a spot on the map and move there, choose a place like Vermont. I also want Vermont to be a possibility for climate refugees who may not have that same level of privilege and choice. We think about Vermont as this climate haven. Well, not everyone has access right now. And from a social perspective, I look at the geopolitical tensions around the world, the governance issues, and then I walk down the street and see fantastic examples of civic discourse, of engaged citizens, and people can sit across the table from each other in Vermont, disagree on issues, but at the end of the day, hug it out as neighbors. So in that regard, more people need Vermont too.
Yeah. So I just want to, because, a lot of people may not even understand what a climate refugee is, right? Like, please explain, Kevin, so that we can make sure that everybody's on the same page. I mean,
sure.
Many people don't have 4 seasons still either. So go ahead.
Yeah, this is a bit informed by my lived experience in the community in Burlington, being a mix of immigrants and refugees. We all ended up in the same place from very different backgrounds. And some of us by choice. Like I said, my parents made a decision, a brave one, to come to the United States and ended up in Vermont. But I have many friends who grew up in refugee camps because they grew up in war-torn countries and were fleeing dangerous situations and would have been happy landing anywhere in the US, but happened to be in Burlington. And I feel so privileged to call them my friends and to be able to share those experiences with them. So that when I talk about climate migrants versus refugees, the main distinction that I make is who has choice, who has privilege, and is Vermont going to be exclusive to climate migrants, or are we also going to proactively create conditions so that refugees have opportunities here too?
Yeah. And I think that's a big clarification, right? Because we think sometimes of privilege only in terms of racial structures, but having a passport is a privilege.
It
Right?
is.
Having a driver's license is a privilege. We have to start kind of sometimes looking at the nuts and bolts of what we mean by people who have access to be able to leave a space, because that's very different, right? And so Vermont has a lot of colleges, so the community is sometimes thought of as very transient. But there are people, like you said before, who would define Vermonters as 10 generations or like these deep roots. And so some of those definitions get, I think, dismantled in this process of visioning as you're telling it. And then some of them get a little bit kind of reinforced. Where do you see the balance?
Yeah. So I think about the origin of the phrase brave little state. And it emerged from a speech that President Calvin Coolidge gave in 1928. And it was in response to the flooding that had happened in 1927. And he traveled around the state to observe the recovery efforts. And he talked about the natural beauty of the state, the hills and the valleys, and the natural climate. But also talked about the indomitable spirit of Vermonters. And I look to the communities around me now, almost 100 years later, and that spirit is still alive, even though the landscape has changed. We've gone through phases where much of Vermont was deforested and then reforested. And through it all, that indomitable spirit lives on. And what I really resonate with in that speech where the phrase brave little state emerged was the concluding remarks where Calvin Coolidge talked about the spirit of liberty. If it were to vanish in other parts of the Union, it could be restored with the amount that was stored up here in Vermont. So back to that idea, Vermont needs more people. More people need Vermont too.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting too, because, okay, so like when we're talking about this deep spirited connection to the land and to the people, we continue to show up as a brave little state on other kind of Census Bureau questions about being one of the most faithless states in the country, right? And so I think it shows up in many different ways where it may not be that traditional religious integration of practice, but it's this person to person dialogue and discourse that you're talking about. Do you see that in your work as well?
I do. Yeah. The faith in neighbors and the faith in the community around us. I'll share with you that part of what drives me forward to do my work is to honor the legacy of my parents. Both of them have passed away. And I try to think about what is the Vermont that they were looking for when they came here, and can I help create that through the work that I'm doing now?
Yeah.
And, in that regard, I feel like with all the change that is happening and continues to happen, if we can create a vision and collectively work towards it, then it gives people a chance to have a sense of faith that the future is going to be better than the past, and that we can all pitch in to make that happen.
Yeah, that's great. So we both have that in common too. Both of my parents have transitioned, and it's something to become a late stage orphan. That's kind of like how I refer to it, right? And as that kind of happens, I think there's a part of you that shifts into questioning, into action, into diligence. And my questions came up as like, okay, well, who am I now? What am I doing this for? And what do I want it to look like? Right. And so can you talk a little bit about maybe how that legacy that you're building about the future of the Vermont that your parents may have wanted to see is kind of this, how did it affect this part of your life?
Yeah, when my mom passed in 2016, and my father passed back in 2001, so my mother passed away more recently. So when I became a late stage orphan, that's where the social network and the social capital that I had built up through my many years of living in Vermont really helped to bring me up during a moment of difficulty in my life. That's the Vermont that I think my parents learned to love. The American dream is often talked about through an economic lens, economic mobility and opportunity. But I also think that the Vermont dream is something a little bit more. And that's where having these strong connections to the people around us, to the places around us, that to me is a part of the magic sauce here in Vermont that I want to continue preserving through multiple generations into the future. So even as the physical landscape changes, the people here change, we can maintain that sense of community and trust and faith in each other.
Yeah, that's beautiful. My parents passed, so I think we have a big gap as well. So my father passed in 2000, right before I went to my senior year of college. My mother passed away more recently in 2018. But when my mom passed away, I was just like, I will probably never go back and live in our hometown, but they loved it. And so what can I do to make sure that their love stays alive? And so that's how we started the Brown Family Memorial Scholarship Fund, right? And so every year we get to kind of reintroduce young people to who these people were in that community, and it just continues to go along. So I love that. I love that. And I often think of Vermont as like a small town that's called a state.
Yeah. Statistically speaking, we look at the numbers, that sounds about right.
That's right. So Kevin, we have a question, right, that we're asking all of our guests this season. And it comes from a quote by Don DeLillo. And he says that the family is the cradle of the world's misinformation. And so I'm wondering if there's any part of your story in terms of your family and your upbringing that became something that you had to unlearn.
A quote that comes to mind that I heard very often as a kid was just focus on yourself. Don't worry about what anyone else is doing. And often I'd hear that in the context of my educational pursuits, sometimes in the context of sports. But as I've gotten older and hopefully a little bit wiser over time, I've realized I do need to pay attention to what's happening around me because I don't live in isolation, nor do I want to. And by paying attention to what's happening around me, I learn more too. I don't know everything. I don't have all the answers, but I can be in community with people that can help me along on the journey. So I've let that go. I still focus on my own personal growth and progression, certainly, but I put it in the context of the community around me.
Yeah, that's beautiful, right? Because we at Sets and Sages, we're constantly saying that no one grows alone. And it doesn't mean that it's not always for the good. Like growth is not always done in a linear, nice, neat fashion.
Never is.
Most of us got to the places where we are through some hard knocks and some bad choices, and we learned some of those bad choices from other people, right? And so as we're trying to transform our lives into something more freeing and fulfilled and accurate to our own identity, it turns out that we might just need some people to do that too.
Couldn't have said any better.
Who are you kind of leaning on, looking at, inspired by these days, Kevin, as you're looking at really creating these new futures for yourself and the people in our community?
I look to the young people in my life, in my family, on the teams that I coach. One of my joys is coaching track and field, and I'll share with you one of my rules as a coach. I always tell athletes that they're allowed to ask me why when I tell them to do something. And if I can't give them a good reason, then they don't have to do what I'm telling them. And I find that it's the little kids that really take advantage of that rule. The 7 to 14-year-olds love asking why. And I wish my college athletes would ask why more often. But it helps me stay accountable to learning and growth and to have reason behind what we're doing, to be intentional about the time that we spend together and the actions that we choose to take together. And I think about the way that I carry that from coaching over to the work that I do with the Futures Project, of constantly asking questions. Data isn't about answers. It's about asking better questions. And I've embedded that in the ethos of the Futures Project by getting rid of our mission statement to pursue a mission question. So the mission question that we pursue is how can we use data to support the evolution of Vermont's economy towards a thriving future with opportunity for all?
That's good. That's good, right? Because questions determine the quality of our lives. And so if we have a mission that we're just blindly following, we may not be evolving in the way that we think we are. I love that. I love
And
that.
statements are static. We can make a statement today.
Yeah.
It might not be relevant in 2 years. Certainly in 10 years, it's probably not going to be relevant anymore. But
Yeah.
the way we return to questions and answer them evolves as the world evolves around us.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Kevin, I think you're doing an amazing job. I think your constant push towards curiosity is something that our state is going to benefit from, not only now, but for years to come. I think you have an amazing capacity for vision, and I'm so grateful that you accepted our invitation to talk with us tonight. Would you like to leave our audience with any final words?
Uncertainty is just opportunity in disguise.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better myself. Don't be afraid of what you don't know. It just means you don't know yet. Listen, thank you, Kevin, so much for joining us. Thank you all for watching. This has been another installment of Wisdom Wednesdays. And before I go, I would be remiss to tell you that if you missed the announcement, I'm doing something we've never done before. I'm giving everyone a free general admission ticket to Vision Camp Virtual. It's on August 19th. You can grab your seat now. All you have to do is jump over to ssvisioncamp.com, spend 3 hours with me on a Saturday, and I promise you, you won't regret it. Thank you, Kevin, again. Thank y'all for watching Wisdom Wednesdays. We'll see you soon. Have a great week.